This wine is reserved for real guests, not staff. The words cut through the heritage wine estate courtyard like shattered glass. Guests froze mid-conversation. A violinist's bow slipped. Even the breeze through the vineyard seemed to stop. Victoria Lancaster, heir to Napa's most powerful wine dynasty, didn't whisper, she projected. Draped in satin red, jewels blazing in the fading sun, she wanted everyone at the white linen tables to hear her dismissal. Across from her stood Aaliyah Monroe, 42, black, clad in an ivory gown, her Cartier watch glinting soft light, her presence understated yet magnetic. She didn't flinch, not when laughter flickered around the tables, not when eyes scanned her like she was an intruder, not a guest. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Aaliyah. Victoria leaned closer, her smile sharpened like a blade. Why don't you return to the staff section where you belong? The murmur that rippled through the crowd wasn't outrage, it was complicity. Half smiles hidden behind champagne flutes, quick glances traded like gossip. A young server stiffened, tray trembling. But Aaliyah's stillness was deliberate. Her hand rested lightly on the stem of her untouched glass, her gaze locked on Victoria's with the quiet weight of a storm contained. This wasn't the first time. She remembered Atlanta at 24, denied a penthouse suite because people like you don't belong there. Miami at 31, when a banker labeled her high risk, despite millions in collateral. Different rooms, same for Dick. And now, on sunlit stone worth generations of wealth, the insult came again. Only tonight, it was aimed at the architect of a $1.2 billion distribution empire, the very contract Victoria's family needed to survive. Aaliyah inhaled slowly, steady as oak-aged Cabernet. She placed the glass down with precision, like anchoring history itself. Victoria mistook silence for submission, but the courtyard would soon learn silence was the sharpest form of power. And in less than 15 minutes, this glittering estate would never be the same. The courtyard didn't return to normal after Victoria's words. Even as the quartet resumed their strings and waiters moved quickly to refill glasses, a current lingered under the evening's polished surface. You could feel it in the way shoulders shifted, in the way conversations turned hushed, then cut off mid-sentence when Aaliyah walked past. 42 years old, a self-made billionaire. Yet tonight she wore no crown of diamonds, no dress screaming for attention. Instead, Aaliyah Monroe chose subtle power, a pearl, white silk gown, clean lines flowing to the stone floor, Cartier steel glinting softly against her wrist. Her hair was loose, waves catching the last threads of sunlight, and her presence was almost understated, deliberately so. Because this evening wasn't about being seen, it was about watching. She had arrived at Heritage Wine Estate without an entourage, without her PR team, without the visible armor most billionaires brought into a room like this. No designer clutch, no gaudy necklace, just a leather folio in hand, slim and discreet. From the outside, she could have been mistaken for a consultant, a staff manager, even a guest's assistant. That mistake was the point. The Lancaster family had extended an invitation weeks earlier, framing the event as a celebration of legacy and partnership. On paper, it was just a family gathering in Napa, yet everyone in the courtyard knew the truth. This party was about a deal, a massive one, a $1.2 billion global distribution contract that would place Lancaster wines in every luxury hotel, restaurant, and airport lounge across 3 continents. And the final signature on that contract belonged to Aaliyah Monroe. She had intended to move quietly through the evening, blending into the curated glow of high society, listening to what was said when people thought no one important was listening. She'd built her empire on observation, seeing what others overlooked, hearing what they dismissed. That's why she wore ivory instead of red, pearls instead of emeralds. To be underestimated was a strategy, but strategies don't always survive contact with ego. Victoria Lancaster wasn't just the evening's hostess. She was the face of a dynasty 39 years old, her beauty as sharp as her ambition, the kind of woman who filled a room with presence alone. And she was used to control. She knew how to smile while delivering an insult, how to wield charm like a knife. Her gaze had swept the courtyard when Aaliyah arrived, pausing just long enough to mark her as an outsider. No family crest on her invitation card, no obvious companion. And worst of all, no deference in her stance. Victoria recognized independence and mistook it for defiance. So she moved quickly, staking her claim over the narrative with a single sentence meant to diminish, "This wine is reserved for real guests, not staff." What Victoria didn't know was that Aaliyah had heard this tone before, too many times. She had heard it at 24 when a hotel manager dismissed her booking. She had heard it at 31 when a banker treated her as high risk. And she heard it again tonight, in the voice of a woman who thought power was measured in family name and inheritance. But the truth was simple. Legacy without leverage is fragile. And leverage, real leverage, sat quietly in Aaliyah's leather folio, ready to decide the fate of this very estate. She let the insult hang, her silence measured, her gaze steady. And as servers moved, and as glasses clinked, and as laughter bubbled forced and brittle around them, the air carried a new weight. One of anticipation, one of inevitability. Because in that moment, the evening had already shifted. The deal, the contract, the future of Lancaster wines it all hung, not in Victoria's jeweled hand, but in the calm of the woman she tried to dismiss. And for the first time all night, a question quietly passed through the crowd. Who exactly is Aaliyah Monroe? It didn't take long for Victoria to press the advantage. She thrived on spectacle, and now every eye in the courtyard was hers. "Security," she called out lightly, as though ordering another bottle of wine. "Make sure this guest is escorted to the proper section." The words floated across the stone courtyard, polished but poisonous. A waiter hesitated, his tray balanced awkwardly in his hands, unsure if she was serious. Another staff member glanced toward the far archway where two men in suits stood at attention. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down into their glasses, unwilling to be part of it. Others leaned closer, their curiosity stronger than their conscience. A ripple of amusement passed through a trio of younger men near the bar. One of them chuckled. Did she really think she belonged here? Victoria's smile never faltered. Her red satin dress caught the light like fire as she stepped closer to Aaliyah. "This is a private family event," she said, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "Our estate has a standard. We can't just let anyone walk in, sip the best vintages, and pretend to be something they're not." The cruelty was casual, almost elegant. That made it worse. Still, Aaliyah didn't respond. Her silence unsettled more than words ever could. She simply rested her folio against the table, her posture steady, her gaze locked on Victoria's with quiet force. A murmur rose from the far end of the table. Elena Ruiz, the young server who had been watching closely, frowned. She whispered to another staff member. Her name was on the list. "I checked it this morning." The words weren't meant to travel, but they did. Guests overheard. The ripple shifted. Victoria caught it too. Her eyes snapped toward Elena, sharp as broken glass. "Stay in your place," she said coldly, "or you'll lose it." The girl shrank back, but the damage was done. Doubt had entered the room. For the first time that evening, the Lancaster heir wasn't entirely in control, and the crowd knew it. Aaliyah didn't blink. The heat of Victoria's words might have burned someone else, but she stood steady, her presence unmoved by the flames. Her silence pressed against the courtyard like a wall of glass, transparent, unshakable, impossible to ignore. The crowd felt it. The laughter that had bubbled minutes earlier thinned into nervous coughs and shifting feet. Guests who had been smirking now avoided eye contact, suddenly unsure where to stand. The tension wasn't loud anymore, it was dense, filling every pocket of air between the linen-draped tables. Victoria tried to reclaim momentum. She tilted her chin higher, flashing her ruby necklace like a scepter. "I said this is a family gathering," she repeated, her tone sharper, harsher now. "If you don't leave on your own, I'll have you removed." But the words landed differently this time. Instead of commanding the space, they hung awkwardly, unanswered. The servers hesitated. The two suited guards by the archway stayed frozen, waiting for clarity that never came. Aaliyah's voice finally broke the silence, low, measured, and steady as stone. "You've made your point," she said. "Now watch closely. You're about to see mine." Her tone wasn't raised, but it carried farther than Victoria's threat. Heads turned, phones lifted discreetly, one guest tilting her glass to cover the glow of her camera lens. Another tapped his watch as if marking the time. At the edge of the courtyard, Elena Ruiz pressed her lips together, courage stirring behind her fear. She whispered again, louder this time, clear enough for a nearby guest to catch. "Her invitation scanned green. I saw it myself." The whisper spread like smoke, passed from table to table until murmurs swirled across the marble floor. Some leaned toward Victoria with questioning looks. Others shifted subtly closer to Aaliyah, as though siding with her carried less risk now. Victoria's smile cracked for the first time, the edges straining under pressure. She glanced around, realizing too late that control was slipping not through force, but through doubt. And standing in the middle of it all, Aaliyah remained silent again. A silence that didn't retreat, a silence that waited. The murmurs didn't fade this time. They grew, overlapping, weaving into the warm Napa air until the courtyard no longer felt like a celebration but a trial. A man in his 50s, dressed in a tailored navy suit, finally spoke from the far end of the long table. His voice was calm but firm, cutting through the chatter. "I saw her name on the guest list, too. She's no imposter." Heads turned toward him, then back to Aaliyah, then to Victoria. The balance shifted 1 degree further. Victoria straightened her shoulders, her red gown gleaming under the string lights. She flashed the kind of smile that had carried her through dozens of fundraisers, galas, and glossy magazine covers, but her words betrayed the strain beneath it. "You don't know who she is," she countered sharply. "For all you know, she walked in off the road." That earned more whispers. The guests weren't buying it. Too many had caught glimpses of Aaliyah's composure, her presence that didn't shrink under scrutiny. From the back, Elena Ruiz stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly but her voice steady. "She was on the system this morning," she said clearly now. "I checked it myself. She belongs here." Gasps rippled across the crowd not because of the information, but because a staff member dared to contradict Victoria Lancaster in public. Every eye snapped to Victoria, waiting for her reaction. Victoria's mask cracked. She turned on Elena with a glare sharp enough to slice stone. "If you value your job, you'll stay silent," she hissed. But silence was no longer an option. Another guest, a woman in her 30s wearing a champagne-colored gown, pulled out her phone, angling it just enough to catch Victoria's words on video. "She's threatening her staff now," the woman muttered, not quietly enough. Phones lifted higher this time. The glow of recording screens dotted the courtyard like fireflies. Aaliyah remained still at the center of it all, her calm presence amplifying every frantic move Victoria made. She didn't need to argue. The crowd was doing it for her. One voice rose from the side. "She hasn't raised her voice once. Look at her. She doesn't need to prove herself." Another followed quickly. "This doesn't look right, Victoria. Not at all." The once united hum of elite approval now fractured into two camps, those shifting nervously closer to Aaliyah, and those shrinking away from Victoria's tightening grip on control. For the first time, the Lancaster air seemed small against the weight of the room she once commanded. And Aaliyah? She hadn't moved an inch. She didn't need to. Victoria's smile was gone now. What remained was raw irritation, sharpened by the sight of glowing phone screens catching every word, every glare, every slip in her control. She stepped closer to Aaliyah, her heels striking the travertine with crisp, deliberate snaps. "Enough of this performance," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "You don't belong here, and you never will. This estate, this world isn't for people like you." The words landed heavy. Gasps rose instantly, louder this time. The crowd no longer hummed with curiosity. It bristled with shock. Even those who had stayed silent shifted back, as though to distance themselves from the venom in her tone. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her silence was deliberate, each second amplifying Victoria's outburst until the imbalance was undeniable. Near the back, the man in the navy suit muttered, "She just said that out loud." Another guest, a younger woman in pearls, whispered back, "On camera." Victoria noticed the phones, but pride drove her forward. She snatched the torn remains of Aaliyah's invitation card from the table where she had left it and held it up like evidence. "This proves nothing. You're a fraud. You came here to pretend, to trick your way into rooms you don't deserve." Her voice cracked on that last word. Deserve. That single word carried more than insult. It revealed fear. The fear that this quiet woman in white might actually be someone Victoria couldn't control. The courtyard's tension tightened like a wire. Servers froze mid-step. Guests leaned in, their faces lit by the pale glow of recording screens. Every eye locked on the two women standing at the center of the storm. And still, Aaliyah said nothing. Her silence was no longer passive. It was power, coiled and waiting. The courtyard had gone still. Only the strings of the quartet lingered faintly, their melody unraveling as the musicians hesitated, unsure whether to play or stop. Victoria didn't hesitate. Rage disguised as composure pushed her forward. She gripped the shredded remains of Aaliyah's invitation and, with deliberate force, ripped them again smaller pieces, fluttering to the stone floor like confetti at a cruel parade. "You see?" she announced, her voice echoing beneath the vineyard arches. "Nothing. No proof. Just another pretender trying to sneak into a world she doesn't understand." Gasps broke through the silence. Someone near the fountain whispered, "She destroyed her card." Another voice followed quickly, "That was her invitation. That's evidence." But Victoria wasn't finished. She turned sharply toward a nearby server, snapping her fingers as though summoning a pet. "Call security. Have her removed. Now." The young man froze, his tray wobbling in his hands. His eyes darted to Aaliyah, then back to Victoria. He didn't move. Frustration cracked through Victoria's polished mask. She reached for the slim leather folio resting on the table beside Aaliyah, fingers curling around its edge. "And this?" she sneered, lifting it high for all to see. "Probably just another prop. Documents don't make you a guest here." Aaliyah didn't reach for it. She didn't react at all. Her gaze stayed level, her presence steady as stone. That restraint unsettled the room more than Victoria's fury. Guests leaned in, their phones raised higher, recording the moment a Lancaster heir crossed a line that couldn't be undone. From the back, Elena Ruiz's voice broke through, louder than before. "That's theft. You can't take her property." Victoria spun, her eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this." But the words didn't erase what everyone had seen. An heir to one of Napa's most powerful families ripping up a guest's credentials and seizing what wasn't hers. The act was no longer about etiquette. It was about arrogance, about control at any cost. And in that charged silence, Aaliyah's calm became the loudest presence in the courtyard. She didn't need to move. She didn't need to speak. Not yet. The air in the courtyard had shifted. What began as whispers was now open shock, the kind that spread quickly and couldn't be contained. Victoria Lancaster, elegant, powerful, untouchable in every other room, had torn up an invitation and seized property in front of dozens of witnesses. And still, Aaliyah hadn't moved. She let the silence stretch, her stillness forcing the crowd to sit in the discomfort Victoria had created. The only sound was the rustle of paper fragments at their feet, a fragile reminder of arrogance made physical. Then, calmly, Aaliyah reached for her phone. No rush, no panic, just a precise motion, like she had rehearsed it 1,000 times before. She lifted it to her ear and spoke in a voice steady enough to cut through the noise. "Nia," she said, her tone low but deliberate. "Initiate protocol. Flag the Lancaster file." On the other end, her assistant's voice was instant, crisp, professional. "Understood. Timestamping. $1 point. 2 billion rupees distribution deal now on hold. Logging video captures from live feeds." Several heads turned sharply at that. A few guests mouthed the number 1.2 billion, as though the magnitude itself couldn't be real. The crowd that had moments ago chuckled was now dead quiet. Victoria froze, the folio still in her hand. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice cracking under the weight of the question. Aaliyah didn't answer her. She wasn't speaking to Victoria anymore. "Nia," she continued into the phone, "document that the host destroyed my credentials in front of witnesses. Ensure compliance footage is archived. Contact legal." "Yes, Miss Monroe," her assistant replied without hesitation. Gasps spread wider now. The name had been spoken. Monroe. Recognition rippled through the courtyard like a shockwave. Someone near the front table whispered, "Monroe. Wait, the Monroe Group? The distribution giant?" Another guest murmured, "She controls luxury imports across Europe. That's her." Eyes widened. Phones rose higher. The tide had turned. Aaliyah finally looked back at Victoria, her gaze steady, her tone as sharp as glass but no louder than before. "You thought silence meant weakness. What it really meant is that I was giving you time to correct yourself." The words landed harder than any raised voice could. And as Victoria clutched the folio with trembling hands, the realization spread across her flawless expression. She wasn't holding a prop. She was holding evidence. Evidence tied to the only deal keeping Lancaster wines alive on the global stage. The very deal that Aaliyah Monroe now held in her power to erase. Recognition spread like fire. It began as whispers, then as pointed stares, until the courtyard hummed with the sound of realization. "She's Monroe," someone said aloud now. "The Monroe Group, she owns distribution across 3 continents." A younger guest near the bar tapped his phone, pulling up an article, then held the screen high for others to see. A Forbes cover gleamed back at them. Aaliyah Monroe, the silent power of global luxury. Gasps rippled through the courtyard as the image traveled down the line of tables, the resemblance undeniable. All at once, the narrative collapsed. The woman Victoria had dismissed, insulted, and accused of fraud stood revealed as the very executive holding her family's future in her hands. Victoria's ruby necklace didn't shine as brightly now. Her polished poise faltered, her knuckles white around the leather folio she'd tried to claim. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, forcing her voice louder as if volume could erase truth. "She's bluffing. Anyone can make a call, anyone can throw around numbers." But the crowd no longer believed her. Their eyes weren't on Victoria anymore. They were on Aaliyah. And Aaliyah didn't need to raise her voice. She simply took the folio back with one calm motion, her fingers steady, her expression unreadable. Then she looked directly at the guests, not at Victoria, and spoke with quiet certainty. "You watched what happened here," she said. "You heard every word. You saw every action. And soon, so will the board." Murmurs turned into nods. Someone near the fountain whispered, "She never yelled once." Another voice, this one firm, "That's real power." Even the staff servers, musicians, guards had shifted subtly. Their eyes lowered not to Aaliyah but to Victoria, as though ashamed of being aligned with her. Elena Ruiz, trembling but resolute now, stepped forward again. Her voice carried more strength this time. "Her name was on the system. She belongs here, and you tried to erase her." That was the crack Victoria couldn't seal. The crowd leaned in, watching, judging, recording. The Lancaster heir who had built her life on appearances now stood exposed, stripped of her control, her arrogance no longer masked as charm. And at the center of it all, Aaliyah Monroe stood as if anchored to the courtyard floor itself, still, steady, untouchable. The silence after her words wasn't weakness, it was dominance. And everyone in the courtyard felt it. The weight of recognition pressed down on the courtyard until even the vines seemed to lean in, listening. Victoria's voice, once sharp and commanding, trembled under the scrutiny of dozens of eyes. "You're all being misled," she insisted, but the defiance in her tone had frayed. She looked less like a hostess in control and more like someone trying to hold back a tide. But the tide had already turned. Guests who had arrived eager to bask in Lancaster glamour now edged away from Victoria's orbit. Phones stayed high, capturing every strained word, every crack in her poise. A man in a crisp tux shook his head. "I've done business with Monroe Group," he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "They don't bluff." Elena Ruiz, the young staff member who had dared to speak up, stood taller now, emboldened by the shift. "You tore up her invitation," she said, her voice steady, clear enough for every guest to hear. "You tried to strip her dignity in front of everyone here." Gasps followed not because it was news, but because someone had said it plainly, without fear. Victoria's eyes darted around the courtyard, searching for allies. But the guests who once orbited her like moths now stood apart, unwilling to be burned. Even the guards by the archway remained rooted, their arms crossed, no longer her instruments of control but silent witnesses to her unraveling. And then Aaliyah spoke again, her tone calm as ever, her words deliberate and precise. "This deal," she said, lifting the folio slightly, "was designed to expand Lancaster wines beyond borders, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, a contract valued at $1.2 billion. The number hung heavy in the air. Someone exhaled sharply. Another whispered, "That's their lifeline." Aaliyah took one measured step forward, the marble beneath her heels echoing like a gavel. "Effective tonight, that deal is terminated." The courtyard erupted. Voices overlapped shock, disbelief, scattered applause. A woman near the back clutched her pearls, whispering, "She just pulled the entire deal." Others didn't whisper at all. "This is justice," a man said, his phone camera locked on Victoria's paling face. Victoria staggered a half step, her hand tightening around her glass as if it were an anchor. But no anchor could hold back the collapse. The smile that once charmed governors and CEOs was gone, replaced with the hollow stare of someone watching her world tilt off its axis. And Aaliyah? She stood unshaken, her voice steady enough to silence the storm she herself had unleashed. "This isn't about wine," she said softly, though every ear caught it. "It's about respect. And tonight, respect is no longer yours to claim." Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. For years, she had been the center of every room, the voice that carried, the presence that silenced others. Now the silence wasn't hers, it belonged to Aaliyah, and that silence was devastating. Phones hovered higher. Guests leaned in closer. The entire courtyard had shifted into witness mode, the atmosphere charged with anticipation of what would happen next. Aaliyah didn't raise her tone, didn't even step closer. She simply lifted her phone again. "Nia," she said, calm and precise. "Lock the Lancaster account. Freeze pending shipments. Notify our legal division to draft termination letters tonight." Her assistant's voice came through crisp and immediate. "Already in motion, Miss Monroe. The distribution contract is suspended. Access to Monroe systems for Lancaster Estate has been revoked." The words hit harder than any shout. Guests exchanged glances, stunned. One of them muttered, "Revoked? That means every international order disappears." The color drained from Victoria's face. She clutched the stem of her glass so tightly it seemed it might shatter. "You can't do that," she spat finally, desperation cutting through the polish. "We've invested millions, our expansion depends on this." Aaliyah's eyes met hers, steady, unwavering. "And you chose to gamble it on arrogance," she replied evenly. "Consider the investment lost." Murmurs surged again, not in her defense this time, but in Aaliyah's favor. "That's justice," she warned her. She stayed calm the whole time. Victoria turned wildly toward the crowd, searching for support, but the faces that once adored her now glared back with judgment. Even the guests who had come to drink her wine and flatter her status pulled away, unwilling to share in the collapse. And then the worst blow came not from Aaliyah, but from within her own staff. Elena Ruiz stepped forward once more, this time standing shoulder to shoulder with Aaliyah. Her voice rang with the kind of courage born from witnessing too much. "You humiliated her," Elena said clearly, pointing at Victoria. "In front of everyone, you tried to erase her, and now you've erased yourself." The courtyard erupted not with chaos, but with applause, scattered at first, then growing louder, sharper, undeniable. Some guests clapped in defiance of Victoria, others in solidarity with Aaliyah, but the sound rolled over the estate like thunder. Victoria's hands trembled. She dropped the ruined pieces of the invitation at her feet. The glass in her grip finally slipped, shattering against the stone floor, wine spilling like blood across the pale marble. The image burned itself into the moment, the heiress of Lancaster, standing in the wreckage of her own arrogance, undone by the woman she tried to dismiss. And in that wreckage, Aaliyah didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply stood, her presence a living verdict. The punishment wasn't rage. It wasn't noise. It was finality. And every person in the courtyard knew Victoria Lancaster's reign had ended not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, but here, under the glow of vineyard lights, in front of the very people she had sought to impress. The courtyard was still ringing with the echo of shattered glass and scattered applause when Aaliyah finally moved. She bent, not hurriedly but with deliberate grace, and placed her folio back on the table as if anchoring the moment in permanence. Victoria stood opposite her, rigid, pale, her red gown no longer regal but gaudy under the harsh light of exposure. Around her, guests formed a quiet semicircle, not in protection but in judgment. No one reached for her. No one defended her. The Lancaster name, so heavy with tradition, felt suddenly weightless. Aaliyah lifted her glass again, not the one Victoria had tried to deny her, but a fresh pour handed silently by Elena Ruiz. The young staffer's hand shook slightly, but her eyes carried steel now, emboldened by the justice she had witnessed. Aaliyah raised the glass just high enough to catch the vineyard lights. Her gaze swept the crowd, not hurried, not commanding, but steady. Each person felt seen, felt measured, felt implicated in the silence that had allowed the insult to breathe. When she spoke, her voice was low but cut with precision, each word sharp as stone. Power doesn't need to scream. It doesn't beg to be recognized. It reveals itself in action, and action leaves no doubt. She paused, letting the words sink into the marble, the vines, the very history of the estate. Phones caught every syllable, their red dots glowing like tiny witnesses. Then she added, her tone softer but more devastating. You tried to erase me in a vineyard my company carries across the world. Tonight, it isn't me erased, it's you. Silence followed, dense, unbroken, absolute. Even the quartet lowered their instruments, unwilling to compete with the finality of her words. Aaliyah took a slow sip of the wine, set the glass down with quiet certainty, and turned toward the exit. She didn't need to look back. The room no longer belonged to Victoria, or to the Lancasters, or to the fragile arrogance of old money. It belonged to truth, to dignity, to the quiet force of a woman who had carried herself through insult, through silence, through power, without ever raising her voice. And as she walked out beneath the vineyard lights, the message lingered behind her like a verdict no one could overturn. Justice had been delivered.